Emma's heart hammered against her ribs as she sat in the imposing courtroom, her small frame dwarfed by towering wooden furniture that seemed designed for giants rather than children. At 8 years old, she had never felt so utterly, completely alone, despite being surrounded by dozens of people. The custody battle between her parents had spiraled into something far darker and more destructive than she could have ever imagined it would become. What had started 2 years ago as a simple disagreement about living arrangements had transformed into a full-scale warfare, complete with accusations of abuse, claims of emotional instability, and assertions of unfitness that echoed through the halls of the courthouse like poison seeping into clean water. Today was the final hearing, the day that would determine everything about her future. The judge would make a decision that would split her world permanently in two. Emma would either live primarily with her mother in the small house on Maple Street, or she would live with her father in his new apartment across town. There was no third option. There was no possibility of things going back to the way they used to be, when her parents were still together, and her biggest concern was whether she would get vanilla or chocolate ice cream after dinner. Those days felt like they belonged to someone else's childhood, to some other girl in some other world. Her mother sat on the left side of the courtroom gallery, dressed in a dark blue blazer that Emma recognized from better times. Her hair was pulled back in a tight bun, and her face was drawn and exhausted. Lines had appeared around her eyes that hadn't been there a year ago. She held a leather folder stuffed with documents and legal briefs, occasionally whispering urgent instructions to her attorney, a stern-faced man named Mr. who seemed perpetually angry about something. Emma's mother refused to make eye contact with her father, though she sat only 15 feet away on the opposite side of the gallery. It was as if she couldn't bear to even look at him, couldn't acknowledge his existence in the same room. Her father sat ramrod straight in his chair, his jaw clenched so tightly that Emma could see the muscles working in his neck from across the room. He wore a dark gray suit that made him look like a stranger, formal, distant, nothing like the dad who used to tickle her until she couldn't breathe from laughing. Next to him sat his attorney, a younger woman with sharp features and sharper eyes, Ms., who had the reputation of being ruthless in custody cases. She had been the one driving most of the recent accusations, the one who had suggested bringing in character witnesses, the one who had orchestrated the entire legal strategy designed to paint Emma's mother as unstable and unfit. The courtroom itself was cold and sterile, painted in institutional shades of gray and beige that seemed designed to drain color and life from everything they touched. High ceilings rose above them, and an imposing bench dominated the front of the room, waiting for the judge to take her seat. American flags stood sentinel in the corners, and the seal of the court hung prominently on the wall. Heavy wooden paneling made the space feel like a tomb, a place where hopes and dreams came to die under the weight of legal procedure and judicial authority. Nobody had asked Emma what she wanted. Nobody had seemed particularly interested in her thoughts, her feelings, or her perspective on the entire situation. She was the subject of the case, the reason everyone was here, the reason this room was filled with tension so thick you could cut it with a knife, and yet she was simultaneously the least important person in the entire proceeding. The adults had made that abundantly clear through their actions and their indifference to her suffering. They fought about who would get custody of her as if she were a trophy or a possession, something valuable to be won rather than a human being with hopes, dreams, and an inner life as rich and complex as their own. Emma clutched her hands together beneath the oak table, squeezing so hard that her fingernails bit into her palms, creating tiny crescents of pain. Her legs swung slightly above the floor. Her feet didn't quite touch the ground when she sat in the heavy courtroom chairs, and the repetitive motion was the only thing keeping her somewhat grounded, the only small way she could exert control in a situation where she felt entirely powerless. She wore a light pink dress that her mother had insisted she wear to make a good impression, though Emma didn't understand what impression a dress was supposed to make in a custody hearing. Didn't the judge care about what was best for her? Didn't the judge care about what she actually wanted? The judge hadn't even looked at her once so far. Judge was a severe-looking woman in her 60s with steel-gray hair pulled back in an immaculate style and sharp eyes that seemed to miss nothing. She had been on the bench for 27 years, according to information Emma's therapist had told her. The judge had presided over hundreds of custody cases, seen countless families torn apart by divorce and legal battles. Her expression was perpetually stern, her mouth set in a thin line, her posture rigid with professional authority. She treated the courtroom like a battlefield, Emma thought, and the people in it like soldiers engaged in combat. There was no warmth in her demeanor, no softness, no recognition that the centerpiece of this legal drama was a terrified child struggling to hold herself together. All Emma could think about was Max, hidden safely outside the courtroom in the care of her therapist, Dr. Sarah. Max was her golden retriever, a service dog who had been trained specifically to recognize when Emma's anxiety was building and to provide physical comfort and grounding techniques. Max was the only being in Emma's world right now who seemed to understand her without needing explanations or justifications. The dog didn't judge her for her fear, didn't demand that she be brave or strong or composed. Max simply loved her unconditionally, completely, without reservation or condition. Emma and Max had bonded immediately when the dog had been introduced into her life 6 months ago, after her panic attacks had become so severe that they were interfering with her schooling. Max could sense when Emma's heart rate was accelerating, when her breathing was becoming shallow, when her anxiety was beginning to spiral out of control. The dog would press his large, warm body against Emma's legs, would rest his head on her lap, would make eye contact with her in a way that seemed to communicate, "I'm here. You're safe. I won't leave you." In a world that felt increasingly chaotic and hostile and uncertain, Max had become Emma's anchor to sanity and calm. But Max wasn't here now. Max was outside, separated from her by courthouse doors and hallways and the rigid rules of the judicial system. And Emma had never needed her dog more than she needed him right now, sitting in this cold courtroom, surrounded by hostile adults and heavy furniture, and the crushing weight of a moment that would determine the entire trajectory of her childhood and adolescence and future. She felt small and vulnerable, and utterly, completely alone, despite being in a room full of people who were supposedly fighting for her best interests. Emma's anxiety spiraled as the courthouse doors opened and court officers began directing people to their seats. The hearing was about to begin. Everything was about to change. And nobody seemed to care that Emma was terrified. The gavel came down with a sharp crack that made Emma flinch in her seat. Judge's voice echoed through the courtroom as she officially called the session to order, her words formal and detached. "This is the continuation of the custody hearing in the matter of Emma. Both parties are present with their legal counsel. We will now hear opening statements and evidence from the petitioners. Mr., you may begin." Emma's mother's attorney stood immediately, buttoning his jacket with deliberate precision as he addressed the judge. His voice was cold, calculated, designed to plant seeds of doubt in the judge's mind before any real evidence was even presented. "Your Honor, in the interests of this child, I will be presenting evidence and testimony that demonstrates a clear and troubling pattern of emotional instability, parental negligence, and psychological harm being inflicted upon the minor by her mother. We will show that Ms. is unfit to provide a safe, stable environment for her daughter." Emma felt her stomach drop. Unfit. That word hung in the air like a curse. She stole a glance at her mother, who had gone pale, her knuckles white as she gripped the edge of the table. Her mother's lips were pressed into a thin line, and Emma could see her jaw working as she fought to control her emotions. Then it started. The first witness was called, a neighbor from her mother's apartment building, a thin, nervous man named Mr. Henderson, who seemed uncomfortable being in the courtroom, but eager to please the attorneys who had subpoenaed him. Under questioning from Ms., her father's attorney, Mr. Henderson began describing incidents he claimed to have witnessed. His testimony tumbled out in a series of damaging statements that painted Emma's mother in the worst possible light. "I've heard screaming coming from her apartment," Mr. Henderson said, his voice uncertain but compliant. "Loud voices, a woman yelling and the child crying, more times than I can count. It sounds like a in there sometimes. One time I almost called the police because it got so bad." Emma felt her chest tightening. She remembered that day. Her mother had been frustrated because Emma had refused to clean her room, and yes, her mother had raised her voice. But her mother hadn't been abusing her. She'd just been frustrated. Didn't all parents get frustrated sometimes? Didn't all children push back against their parents' instructions? Mr. Emma's mother's attorney stood to cross-examine. "Mr. Henderson, in all the time you've lived in that building, have you ever actually witnessed any physical contact, any bruises, any signs of abuse on the child?" "Well, no, but—" "A simple yes or no, please. Have you ever witnessed physical abuse?" "No." "Thank you, that's all." But the damage was done. The judge had taken notes, her pen moving across the legal pad with each damaging testimony, and there was more to come. The next witness was called. Doctor, a clinical psychologist hired by Emma's father's legal team. He was an older man with an authoritative demeanor who spoke with the confidence of someone accustomed to being believed. Under Ms. careful questioning, Doctor presented a psychological profile of Emma's mother that was absolutely devastating. He had reviewed court documents, police records, and interviews with family members, and in his professional opinion, Emma's mother exhibited signs of borderline personality disorder, emotional dysregulation, and impulse control issues. "A person with these characteristics," Doctor explained in his clinical tone, "can be unpredictable and emotionally volatile. While not necessarily abusive in the traditional sense, they create an unstable home environment that is psychologically harmful to children. The child in this case has been exposed to inconsistent parenting, emotional turbulence, and an inability to predict her mother's emotional state. This creates significant anxiety in the child." Emma felt tears pricking at her eyes. He was right about one thing: she did have anxiety. But it wasn't because her mother was crazy or unstable. It was because of all of this. It was because her parents were destroying her family, because adults kept making decisions that affected her life without asking her, because she was being pulled in two different directions and expected to just accept it. Then came the audio recordings. Ms. stood and announced, "Your Honor, I would like to present recorded evidence of a conversation between the parties from 3 months ago." The courtroom fell silent as a small speaker was set up. Then Emma heard her mother's voice, angry, sharp, cutting through the speakers with an intensity that made Emma wince. Her mother was yelling about missed child support payments, about her father's irresponsibility, about how she was tired of struggling financially while he dated new women and lived a carefree life. "You don't care about Emma, you never have, you just care about yourself." Her mother's recorded voice filled the courtroom. Emma's father sat rigid in his chair, his face flushed with anger and embarrassment. Several people in the gallery glanced toward Emma, making her want to sink into her chair and disappear entirely. But her father's attorney didn't stop there. More recordings were played, fragments of conversations, moments when Emma's mother had been frustrated or angry, words spoken in private moments that were never meant to be heard by a judge or a courtroom full of strangers. Each recording chipped away at Emma's image of her mother, replacing it with a portrait of an unstable, bitter woman consumed by rage. When it was Mr.'s turn to present his case, he brought forward a series of character witnesses: Emma's teacher, the director of the center where Emma spent afternoons, a family friend. That Emma was a well-adjusted child, that her mother was devoted and loving, that the yelling and anger they had heard about was contextual and situational, not indicative of abuse. One witness, Mrs. Grace, the woman who lived in the apartment directly above Emma's, that she had known Emma's mother for 3 years and had never witnessed anything concerning. "She's a wonderful mother," Mrs. Grace said firmly. "She's patient with Emma, she's involved in her schooling, she takes her to activities. Yes, I've heard raised voices occasionally, but what parent doesn't raise their voice sometimes? It doesn't mean she's unfit." But Emma could see the skepticism on Judge's face. The judge had already heard the psychological expert, already heard the disturbing recordings, already been presented with the narrative that Emma's mother was emotionally unstable. The character witnesses seemed insufficient against the weight of the clinical testimony and the damaging audio evidence. As the morning progressed into afternoon, Emma felt physically ill. Her head pounded. Her stomach churned. She wanted to scream that everyone was lying, that they were all twisting things, that her mother wasn't a monster and her father wasn't a saint. She wanted to tell them that she loved both her parents, that she didn't want to choose, that she didn't want to live in a world where she had to pick one parent over the other. The attacks continued, back and forth, each side launching their artillery with precision and strategic timing. Emma's father's attorney presented evidence of missed therapy appointments that somehow suggested her mother didn't care about Emma's mental health. Emma's mother's attorney countered with medical records showing regular checkups and vaccinations. Around and around they went, using Emma's life as ammunition in a war that had nothing to do with her actual and everything to do with ego, resentment, and the desire to win at any cost. Emma sat in her small chair, watching the adults destroy each other, and felt herself beginning to crack from the inside out. Nobody was listening to her. Nobody cared what she thought or felt. She was a case file, a custody matter, a disputed asset to be divided and assigned to the most worthy parent. She was invisible despite being the reason everyone was here. Her hands trembled. Her chest felt tight. Something was building inside her, something dark and desperate, and she still had no idea how to make it stop. The afternoon session began at 2 o'clock, and with it came a renewed intensity that seemed even more vicious than the morning proceedings. Judge had called for a lunch recess, during which Emma had been escorted to a small waiting room with her mother. They sat in awkward silence, her mother picking at a sad-looking sandwich while Emma pushed food around on a paper plate, unable to eat anything despite the hollow feeling in her stomach. Her mother had tried to reassure her, had whispered, "Don't worry, sweetheart. Everything is going to be okay." But Emma could see the fear in her mother's eyes, the way her hands shook slightly as she held her coffee cup. Now, as the afternoon session resumed, Emma felt something fundamentally different happening inside her body. It started as a subtle tightness in her chest, a sensation she had come to recognize from her therapy sessions with Dr. Sarah, the beginning stages of a panic attack. Emma's therapist had taught her to identify the warning signs, the rapid heartbeat, the shallow breathing, the tingling sensation in her fingertips. But knowing the signs and being able to control them were two very different things, especially in a situation as stressful as this. Emma's father's attorney, Ms., had called a new witness, a woman named Dr. Williams, who identified herself as a custody evaluator. This woman had spent time in Emma's mother's home, had interviewed both parents, and had observed Emma in various settings. She was presenting her findings to the court, and each word seemed designed to hammer another nail into Emma's mother's coffin. "In my professional evaluation," Dr. Williams stated with clinical precision, the child's mother demonstrated several concerning characteristics. The home environment, while physically clean and adequate, showed signs of disorganization. The mother struggled with time management, frequently appearing flustered and overwhelmed during my visits. Most concerning was the child's own demeanor. She appeared anxious and hypervigilant, constantly monitoring her mother's mood and emotional state. These are classic signs of a child living in an unstable home environment with an emotionally caregiver. Emma's breath caught in her throat, hypervigilant. She was always watching her mother's mood because she loved her mother and didn't want her to be sad or angry. Wasn't that normal? Wasn't that what children were supposed to do, pay attention to their parents' emotional states? The tightness in Emma's chest began to intensify. She could feel her heart accelerating, the beats coming faster and harder, as if her heart was trying to escape from her. Her hands grew clammy and she rubbed them on her dress, leaving small damp patches on the pink fabric. Around her, the courtroom seemed to be getting smaller, the walls closing in, the air becoming thicker and harder to breathe. Emma's mother glanced over at her, concern flickering across her face as she noticed her daughter's distressed expression. She reached out and squeezed Emma's hand gently, mouthing the words, "It's okay." But then Mr. tugged at her mother's sleeve, demanding her attention for something he needed to discuss before his cross-examination. Her mother's hand slipped away from Emma's, and the little girl was left alone with her escalating panic. The courtroom continued its assault of words and accusations. Ms. Cross-examination of Dr. Williams was brief and supportive, allowing the witness to reiterate her most damaging conclusions. Then Mr. stood to challenge the evaluation, his voice rising with frustration as Dr. Williams calmly defended her findings. The two attorneys began to argue, their voices overlapping, their words becoming a cacophony of legal jargon and competing arguments. Emma's breathing became increasingly shallow. She was taking rapid, short breaths that didn't seem to fill her lungs with enough oxygen. Her vision began to blur slightly at the edges, and she felt lightheaded, as though she was watching the courtroom from very far away, as though she was looking at everything through a tunnel that was getting narrower and narrower. The judge banged her gavel, demanding order as the attorneys' voices grew even louder and more hostile. The sound of the gavel hitting the bench reverberated through Emma's body like a physical blow. She flinched violently, her whole frame shaking with the force of her fear. Her fingertips had begun to tingle, a sensation spreading up her arms like electricity. This was what happened before the panic fully took over. This electrical sensation that Dr. Sarah had explained was her body flooding with adrenaline in preparation for fight or flight. Emma gripped the edge of the table so hard that her knuckles turned white, her small fingers digging into the wood grain. She wanted to scream. She wanted to run out of the courtroom, to push through those heavy doors and find Max, to feel her dog's warm body against her legs, to have just one moment of comfort and peace. But she couldn't move. She was frozen in her chair, trapped, unable to escape. The fluorescent lights buzzed overhead with a sound that seemed to grow louder and more intrusive with each passing second. Emma had never really noticed that buzzing before, but now it dominated her awareness, filling her mind with an incessant mechanical drone. Combined with the overlapping voices, the sound of papers being shuffled, the occasional bang of the gavel, the various sounds of the courtroom, Emma felt as though her senses were being assaulted from all directions. Her vision continued to blur. The room seemed to spin slightly, and Emma gripped the table harder, afraid that if she let go, she would fall off her chair and tumble to the marble floor far below. Her stomach churned violently, and she wondered if she was going to vomit right there in the courtroom, adding even more humiliation to an already unbearable situation. The court clerk called out a new witness, another expert, another professional prepared to testify about her mother's fitness as a parent. Emma's father sat forward in his chair, his expression grim with satisfaction. His team was winning. She could see it in the body language of his attorneys, in the way they exchanged quick looks of satisfaction and confidence. Emma felt tears beginning to stream down her face without her having consciously decided to cry. Her whole body was trembling now, tiny involuntary movements that she couldn't control. She was drowning. That was the only way to describe what was happening. She was drowning in a sea of adult hostility and legal procedure, and her own overwhelming fear and anxiety. Nobody noticed. Her mother was too focused on taking frantic notes for her attorney. The judge was reviewing documents. The attorneys were exchanging arguments. The courtroom was full of people, but Emma was utterly, completely alone, sinking beneath the surface of a panic attack so severe that she couldn't remember ever experiencing anything like it before. This was the moment. This was the moment when Emma knew with absolute certainty that she could not endure this anymore. Something had to change. Something had to happen to make the adults stop and actually pay attention to what their warfare was doing to their daughter. She couldn't take another minute of this. She couldn't survive another hour, another day of this courtroom and these testimonies and these attacks on her family. Emma closed her eyes and thought of Max, loyal, faithful Max, the only being in her world who truly understood her suffering. She thought of his warm body, his soft fur, his unconditional love. And in that moment of desperation, Emma made a decision that would change everything. Emma's eyes remained closed as she tried desperately to find even a single moment of calm within the chaos that was consuming her. The voices around her seemed to blur into a single, incomprehensible drone. The judge's authority, the attorney's arguments, the witness's clinical assessments all melding together into white noise. The panic attack was reaching its crescendo, and Emma knew with absolute certainty that she had only seconds before it completely overwhelmed her, before she lost control entirely in front of everyone. But somewhere deep within her desperation, a spark of hope flickered. She thought of Max, not the image of Max as a dog, but Max as her anchor, her lifeline, her reason for breathing through this moment. Emma's therapist, Dr. Sarah, had worked extensively with her over the past several months, teaching her specific techniques and signals to use when she felt her anxiety spiraling out of control. One of those techniques was the signal, a specific gesture that Max had been trained to recognize with absolute precision. It was a signal that meant, "I need you, I'm struggling, come to me now." The signal was subtle and small, something that wouldn't necessarily draw attention from the casual observer, but it was unmistakable to Max. Emma had practiced it hundreds of times, first in Dr. Sarah's office, then at home, then in various public settings as part of Max's advanced training. The golden retriever had learned to associate the gesture with his purpose, with his calling, to provide comfort and grounding to the person he loved most in the world. Before Emma could second-guess herself, before logic could intervene and remind her of the rules and procedures, and the fact that dogs weren't allowed in courtrooms, she did it. With her hands hidden beneath the table, her body still rigid with panic, Emma made the signal. Her thumb and index finger touched together in a specific pattern, a gesture so small it might have appeared to be nothing more than nervous fidgeting to anyone who happened to glance in her direction. Then, accompanying the hand gesture, Emma let out a soft whistling sound, barely audible above the ambient noise of the courtroom, but distinct enough that it cut through the chaos with the precision of a blade. It was a whistle that Max would recognize anywhere, in any circumstance, no matter how much other noise surrounded it. The whistle was the frequency of their bond, the sonic representation of their connection. Emma held her breath and waited. For a moment, nothing happened. The courtroom continued on, the judge and attorneys completely unaware that a moment of monumental significance had just occurred. The new witness, a doctor, continued presenting her findings about Emma's father's stability as a parent, much more favorable testimony than had been presented for Emma's mother. The attorneys continued their verbal sparring. The court officers remained at their posts. And then Emma heard it, the softest of sounds from the back of the courtroom, barely audible over the courtroom noise. It was the sound of a door being carefully opened. How Max had gotten out of Dr. Sarah's care was something Emma would wonder about for the rest of her life. Later, her therapist would explain that Max's bond with Emma was so strong, his training so thorough, that when he heard his girl's distress signal, no human command could have kept him at bay. Dr. Sarah had been holding his leash in the courthouse hallway outside the courtroom, monitoring Emma through the glass window in the courtroom door. When she saw Emma's lips move, heard the faint whistle even from outside, she realized what was happening, and she made a conscious decision in that moment, a decision that would later be both praised and questioned by various parties, to let Max go. The leash simply slipped from Dr. Sarah's hands as Max pushed past her and through the courtroom door with single-minded determination. The golden retriever moved with purpose, his large frame moving silently down the center aisle of the courtroom. His honey-colored coat caught the fluorescent light as he trotted forward, his amber eyes locked directly on Emma, seeing nothing and no one else in the room. Emma watched, scarcely daring to breathe, as Max approached. The dog's presence was like a beacon of safety approaching through darkness. Every muscle in Emma's body seemed to recognize him, seemed to respond to his nearness with relief, so profound it was almost painful. Max reached Emma's chair and didn't hesitate. The golden retriever, trained to respond to her needs, pressed his large, warm body directly against Emma's legs, his head resting gently on her lap. It was the exact position he had been trained to take when Emma was in distress, a position designed to ground her, to remind her that she wasn't alone, to provide the physical comfort and emotional support that no person in that room seemed capable of offering. Emma's hands moved of their own accord, burying themselves in Max's soft fur. The sensation was immediate and profound. It was as if all the panic, all the anxiety, all the overwhelming terror that had been building inside her suddenly had somewhere to go, somewhere to be channeled. Max's warmth radiated through her, and his steady presence seemed to communicate wordlessly. "You're not alone. I'm here. Everything will be okay." Emma's breathing, which had been rapid and shallow and desperately inadequate just moments before, began to slow and deepen. She pressed her face against Max's soft head, inhaling the familiar scent that meant safety and love. Her hands gripped his fur, and she felt herself beginning to return to her body, beginning to come back from the edge of the panic attack that had threatened to completely consume her. Max remained perfectly still, a golden statue of devotion and unconditional love. He didn't move, didn't acknowledge the shocked silence that had fallen over the courtroom, didn't respond to the various people who were clearly struggling to understand what was happening. The dog was completely focused on Emma, on providing exactly what she needed in that moment: presence, comfort, grounding, and love. Emma's heart rate continued to slow. Her breathing deepened further. Color began to return to her face as the immediate panic subsided, replaced by a different kind of emotion: relief, gratitude, a profound sense of not being alone anymore. Max had come. Despite all the obstacles, despite all the rules and procedures and courtroom decorum, her faithful companion had answered her call and was now providing the comfort that everyone else in the room had failed to offer. In that moment, pressing her face against Max's golden head, Emma understood something fundamental about her situation and about what truly mattered. She understood that adults could argue and fight and present evidence and make testimony and cite legal precedent, but none of that changed the fact that she was a child who needed love and stability, and the recognition that her was more important than winning a custody battle. Max had understood this simple truth instinctively, and his arrival, his presence, his unconditional devotion was about to change the entire trajectory of the courtroom proceeding in ways that no one could have anticipated. Judge's gavel was raised mid-motion, poised to strike the bench as she prepared to call for a brief recess. Her hand was suspended in the air, the wooden gavel ready to come down with the authoritative crack that had punctuated the entire day's proceedings. Her mouth was open, about to speak, her eyes scanning the courtroom documents one final time before she made her announcement. She had been about to declare a 15-minute break, a pause in the relentless march of testimony and legal arguments that had consumed the entire afternoon. And then she saw it. The judge's eyes, sharp and observant despite decades of courtroom experience, caught the movement of the golden dog entering from the back of the courtroom. Her gaze followed the retriever's purposeful journey down the center aisle, her mind initially registering confusion, then alarm, then something else entirely as she watched the dog approach the small girl sitting at the table. Judge's hand froze. The gavel remained suspended in midair, never coming down. Her mouth closed. Every muscle in her face seemed to pause as though she had been turned to stone mid-gesture. The entire courtroom seemed to sense the shift in energy simultaneously. It was as if someone had pressed the pause button on reality itself, halting the proceedings in an instant. Doctor, the witness who had been speaking just moments before, stopped mid-sentence. Her words simply trailed off into silence as she, too, became aware that something significant had just happened. She glanced around the courtroom, her professional demeanor cracking slightly as she tried to understand what was occurring. Ms. Emma's father's attorney stood up abruptly from her chair, her sharp expression replacing with shock. "Your Honor, there's a dog." But the judge held up one hand, silencing her with a gesture. Judge's eyes remained fixed on Emma and Max. Mr. Emma's mother's attorney also stood, his mouth opening and closing as he tried to articulate an appropriate legal response to this unprecedented situation. "Your Honor, Everyone, please remain silent," Judge commanded, her voice cutting through the courtroom with surprising gentleness. The court officers, who had begun moving toward Max with the clear intention of removing the dog from the courtroom, stopped in their tracks. One of them looked toward the judge for guidance, uncertainty written across his face. The judge shook her head almost imperceptibly, a subtle gesture that communicated, "Let this play out." Emma's parents both gasped simultaneously, shock registering on their faces as they realized what was happening. Emma's mother half rose from her seat, as if she might move toward her daughter, but then hesitated, uncertain of the appropriate action. Emma's father remained rigidly seated, his expression shifting from confusion to something that might have been understanding, or perhaps recognition of what this moment truly represented. The entire gallery of observers, family members, friends, court-appointed personnel, and various others who had been attending the hearing, fell silent. All eyes in the courtroom were now focused entirely on Emma and Max. The background noise of shuffling papers, quiet conversations, and general courtroom murmur simply ceased. Judge slowly lowered her gavel, setting it down on the bench with deliberate care. She remained standing, her posture rigid and formal, but something in her expression had fundamentally shifted. The stern, impassive mask that she had maintained throughout the entire proceeding seemed to crack ever so slightly. The judge's eyes moved from Emma to Max and back again. She watched as the golden retriever pressed his body against the frightened child, watched as Emma's trembling hand sank into the dog's soft fur, watched as the visible tension in Emma's small shoulders seemed to ease with each passing second. She observed the way Emma's breathing slowed, the way color returned to the girl's pale face, the way Emma's entire demeanor transformed from absolute terror to something approaching peace. It was a moment of profound clarity. Judge's decades of judicial experience, all those custody cases, all those families torn apart by divorce and litigation, all those children caught in the crossfire of parental warfare, suddenly crystallized into a single moment of understanding. In that instant, watching a terrified 8-year-old girl find solace and grounding in her service dog, Judge saw something that no expert testimony, no legal documentation, no custody evaluation, no psychological assessment had managed to communicate. She saw the reality of what her courtroom was doing. The judge's eyes began to glisten with moisture. For a woman who had maintained absolute professional composure throughout 27 years on the bench, this was extraordinary. Her jaw tightened slightly as she fought to maintain her composure, fought to process what she was witnessing. "Clear the courtroom," Judge said quietly to her bailiff. "Everyone except the parents and their attorneys." There was immediate confusion. Spectators began gathering their belongings, uncertain whether this was the right course of action. The bailiff began gently but firmly directing people toward the exits. The courtroom, which had been filled with perhaps 20 observers, began to empty out. Judge remained standing at her bench, her eyes never leaving Emma and Max. She watched as the gallery cleared, as the observers filed out through the heavy wooden doors. She watched as the courtroom became quieter, more intimate, more focused. Once the courtroom had been emptied of spectators, Judge spoke again. "Court will adjourn for 1 hour," she announced, her voice carrying unusual weight and gravity. When we reconvene, there will be changes to how we proceed." She turned to address Emma's parents directly, her gaze moving from mother to father with unmistakable intensity. "I have spent 3 days listening to arguments about custody, about fitness as parents, about psychological evaluations and character assessments. But what I just witnessed is something that no testimony can provide, a window into the emotional reality of this child's experience." The judge gestured toward Emma and Max, still positioned together, the girl's face buried in the dog's fur. "This is a child in distress, being comforted by her service animal, an animal that somehow managed to arrive in this courtroom at a moment of acute crisis. This is not coincidence. This is not an accident. This is a child and a dog communicating something to this court that all of your legal arguments have failed to convey." Judge's voice became firmer, more commanding. "We are going to take an extended recess. During this time, I am going to meet with Emma in my chambers, along with a court-appointed child psychologist and her service dog. No parents, no attorneys, just Emma and the people who can help her express her needs and desires without the pressure of this adversarial proceeding." She looked directly at both attorneys. "This courtroom has lost sight of its purpose. We are here because a child needs protection and stability, not because her parents deserve to win a contest. That ends now." Judge's gaze returned to Emma one final time before she spoke her final words before the recess. "And someone needs to explain to me how that dog got into my courtroom, because I have a strong suspicion that someone made a very human choice to prioritize a child's over judicial protocol. That, at least, shows some sense of what this proceeding should have been about from the beginning." With that, the judge rose and left the bench, leaving behind a courtroom transformed by a single moment of clarity, a moment that had frozen time and shifted perspective in ways that no legal argument could have accomplished. The 1-hour recess stretched out in real time, though it felt simultaneously longer and shorter than 60 minutes should have been. The courtroom had emptied of spectators, leaving only the essential personnel, the parents and their attorneys. Emma sat with Max beside her, the dog having never left her side since his dramatic arrival. A court officer had been discreetly stationed nearby, but whether his presence was to ensure the dog didn't cause trouble or to protect Emma wasn't entirely clear. During the recess, there had been heated discussion between the attorneys. Ms. had immediately demanded an explanation for how a dog had gained access to the courtroom, suggesting that the proceedings should be voided due to the disruption. Mr. had countered that the dog's arrival was actually evidence of Emma's attachment to her mother, who had arranged the service animal situation, suggesting it proved her mother's care and concern for Emma's. The arguments had gone in circles, neither attorney aware that their entire strategy had just been fundamentally undermined by a moment of unscripted authenticity. But Judge was not thinking about legal protocols or procedural arguments. She was in her chambers, reviewing her notes and reflecting on something that had become increasingly clear to her over the course of this hearing. She had been so focused on the legal case that she had completely lost sight of the human at the center of it. The judge had presided over hundreds of custody cases. She had seen the worst of human behavior, watched as divorcing parents weaponized their children against each other, observed the collateral damage that resulted from unresolved anger and bitterness. But somehow, in the relentless march of testimony and documentation and professional assessment, she had forgotten something fundamental. These cases were about children, real children. Children who had faces and voices and needs and emotions. Emma had a face, and that face had been pale with terror and panic until Max arrived. Judge had made a career of believing in the objectivity of the law, in the power of evidence and testimony to reveal truth. But watching Emma and Max, she had suddenly understood the limitation of that approach. Some truths couldn't be captured in testimony. Some realities couldn't be documented in psychological evaluations. Some knowledge had to be witnessed directly, experienced immediately, felt in the moment. The judge picked up her phone and called the Family Services Coordinator. I need a court-appointed child psychologist in my chambers in 10 minutes, and I need to know the name of the therapist who brought the service dog. I have a suspicion we should include her in this conversation." When the requested individuals arrived, Dr. Reeves, the court-appointed psychologist, and Dr. Sarah, Emma's personal therapist, Judge explained her intentions without hesitation or ambiguity. "I'm going to meet with Emma alone, with both of you present as observers and professionals. I want to hear directly from this child what her needs are, what her wishes are, and what she believes would be best for her. Not through lawyers, not through expert testimony, directly from her. And her dog will be present because it's clear that her dog is the only being in this courtroom who has been providing her actual comfort and support." Dr. Sarah's eyes widened slightly. "Your Honor, I'm not sure I fully understand." "I'm going to violate every procedural norm that typically governs custody hearings," Judge said bluntly. "Because the procedures haven't worked. The procedures have kept us focused on winning and losing instead of focused on what's best for a child. So we're going to try something different. We're going to listen to Emma." When Emma was escorted into Judge's chambers by a court officer, Max padding along beside her on a leash that Dr. Sarah held, the little girl's eyes were wide with apprehension. She had never been alone with a judge before. She had never been in a judge's private chambers. She had certainly never been in a situation where she was expected to speak directly to judicial authority without her parents or their attorneys present. Judge, however, had made a conscious choice to soften her demeanor. She stood as Emma entered, a gesture of respect that immediately altered the power dynamic. She smiled, a genuine smile, not the thin professional smile she typically offered, and gestured toward a comfortable chair in front of her desk. "Emma, I want you to know that you're not in trouble," the judge began. "I asked you to come here because I want to understand something, and I want to hear it directly from you, not from adults speaking about you or for you. Do you understand?" Emma nodded slowly, her small hand gripping Max's leash. Max sat at her feet, his presence immediately calming her initial anxiety. "First, I want to know how you're feeling right now. Are you okay?" Emma's voice was small but steady. "I'm scared. I don't like the courtroom." "Why are you scared?" "Because everyone is angry and sad, and they keep saying mean things about my mommy and my daddy, and I love them both, and I don't understand why they're fighting so much." Judge leaned forward slightly. "That must be very difficult." "It is," Emma said, and then the words began to pour out. "I have really bad panic attacks now because I'm worried about having to choose. I don't want to choose. I love them both. I need them both. And I'm so tired of hearing about all the bad things they've done. I just want everything to go back to normal." Dr. Reeves, the psychologist, asked gently, "Emma, do you think things can ever go back to exactly normal?" Emma considered the question seriously. "No, but they could be. Better, not like this. Not with everyone fighting." Judge continued, "Emma, if you could have anything you wanted regarding where you live and how you spend time with your parents, what would that be?" Emma took a deep breath. "I want to live with both of them, like I want to go back and forth, so I can see my mommy some days and my daddy other days, but only if they stop fighting, only if they're nice to each other, because I can't keep feeling like this. The panic attacks are really bad, and I hate that they're always so angry." "What would help you feel safer?" Dr. Sarah asked softly. "If they talked to each other nicely, if they didn't yell, if they helped me instead of fighting over me, and Max helps me. Max helps me the most." Emma's hand went down to her dog's head, scratching behind his ears. Max's tail thumped against the floor, his presence steady and comforting. Over the next 40 minutes, Judge conducted what amounted to an informal child assessment, but one that was fundamentally different from the formal evaluations that had been presented in court. She didn't ask leading questions. She didn't suggest particular answers. She simply listened to an 8-year-old girl express her needs, her fears, her hopes, and her vision for what her family could be if the adults involved would prioritize her over their own anger and vindication. When the conversation concluded, Judge walked Emma and Max back to the courtroom personally, Dr. Sarah and Dr. Reeves following behind. The judge's expression had transformed. Her eyes held a determination and resolve that suggested she had made a decision that would reshape this entire proceeding. "I've heard what I needed to hear," Judge said quietly to Dr. Reeves as they walked, "and I'm going to make sure that what this child has expressed finds its way into my ruling. This case isn't about what the attorneys want or what the parents want. It's about what Emma needs." She looked back at the little girl walking beside her, holding Max's leash, her expression no longer quite so frightened. "And what Emma needs is stability, love from both parents, and freedom from this courtroom warfare." When they entered the courtroom again, Judge took her seat at the bench and looked directly at both attorneys. "We're going to reconvene, but there are going to be some significant changes to how I proceed. Emma has just spent 40 minutes speaking with me, with Dr. Reeves, and with Dr. Sarah. And I've learned more about what's best for this child in those 40 minutes than I learned in 3 days of courtroom proceedings." The judge's voice was steady and authoritative. "The law exists to protect the vulnerable, and in this case, I believe the law, as we've been applying it, has failed to protect the most vulnerable person in this courtroom. That changes right now." The courtroom reconvened with palpable tension. Emma sat at the same small table, Max positioned protectively at her feet, the dog's leash held loosely in her hand. The gallery had remained mostly empty, with only essential court personnel present. Both attorneys sensed that something fundamental had shifted during the recess, though neither could articulate exactly what or why. Judge took her seat at the bench and looked directly at Emma. "I want the record to show that I have conducted a private meeting with the minor in this case, with appropriate professional observers present. Based on that conversation, and based on what I have witnessed in this courtroom today, I am going to make an unprecedented decision. We are going to continue this hearing, but with a critical modification. Emma will be heard. Not through expert testimony, not through her parents' narratives, but directly. Emma will speak to this court about her own needs, her own wishes, and her own understanding of her situation." Ms. immediately objected. "Your Honor, with all due respect, the minor's testimony could be influenced by—" "By what?" Judge cut her off sharply. "By the truth, by authenticity, by a child's actual perspective. Those are exactly the influences I want present in my courtroom right now. Ms., your objection is noted and overruled." The judge turned to Emma. "Emma, I want you to tell this courtroom, tell these adults who are making decisions about your life, what you told me in my chambers. Can you do that?" Emma's hands trembled slightly as she gripped Max's fur. The dog remained perfectly still, his presence providing the anchoring that she needed. She took a deep breath, and then she began to speak. "I don't like this courtroom," Emma said, her voice soft but surprisingly steady. "I don't like listening to people say bad things about my mommy and my daddy. They're not bad people. They're just really angry at each other right now." Emma's mother's eyes filled with tears. Her father leaned forward, his expression shifting from the stern mask he had maintained throughout the hearing to something softer, more vulnerable. "Sometimes my mommy yells," Emma continued, "but she yells because she's frustrated, not because she's mean. And my daddy has been absent a lot, but I know he loves me even when he's not there. They both love me, and I love them both." "Can you tell the court what the testimonies today made you feel?" Judge asked gently. Emma's voice grew quieter but more intense. "It made me feel like I was something they were fighting about, like I was a toy they both wanted instead of a person they love. They kept saying mean things about each other, and I kept thinking, these are my parents. These are the people I came from. And if they hate each other so much, what does that mean about me?" The courtroom fell silent. Dr. Reeves, observing from the side of the room, made notes, his expression focused and professional. Dr. Sarah sat with her hands folded, tears streaming down her own face as she listened to her young patient articulate the emotional toll of this proceeding. "I have really bad panic attacks now," Emma said, and her voice cracked slightly. "They started after the fighting got really bad. I used to have bad anxiety sometimes, but now I have panic attacks where I can't breathe and I feel like I'm dying. My therapist, Dr. Sarah, says it's because I'm scared and stressed. And I am. I'm scared all the time. I'm scared of having to choose. I'm scared that if I pick one parent, the other one will hate me. I'm scared that no matter what happens, somebody is going to be unhappy with me." Emma paused, and her small hand continued to grip Max's fur. The dog's tail wagged softly, as if he understood the importance of this moment. "The only time I feel okay is when I'm with Max," Emma said, "because Max doesn't want me to pick a side. Max doesn't have expectations. Max just loves me and helps me breathe and reminds me that I'm not alone. And when I was in this courtroom today and everything was getting so loud and everyone was so angry, I thought I was going to die from a panic attack. But then Max came, and everything got better." Judge leaned forward. "Emma, what would make things better for you? What do you think would help your situation?" Emma took another deep breath. "I want to live with both of them, not like all the time with one person, but like some days with my mommy and some days with my daddy. So I can be with both of them and they can both be my parents, but only if they stop fighting. I can't keep living like this. I can't keep being in the middle of a war." "And what would help them stop fighting?" the judge asked. "If they talked to each other nicely," Emma said. "If they went to counseling or therapy or something so they could learn to be nice again. If they could remember that they don't have to hate each other just because they don't want to be married to each other. They could be co-parents. That's what Dr. Sarah calls it." Emma's father made a small sound, something between a gasp and a sob. He covered his face with his hand briefly before composing himself. "I miss my daddy," Emma said, her voice breaking slightly. "But I also don't want to leave my mommy. I need them both. And I need them to stop using me as a weapon in their fight. I need them to remember that I'm their daughter, not their enemy." Then Emma said something that struck at the heart of the entire proceeding. "I don't think it's fair that I have to sit in a courtroom and listen to grown-ups prove that the other grown-up is bad. Both my parents are good people. They're just sad and angry right now. And I'm sad and angry too. I'm sad that my family got broken. I'm angry that nobody asked me what I wanted until today." The courtroom was utterly silent. Even the court officers seemed affected by the raw honesty of an 8-year-old girl speaking her truth. Judge's eyes glistened with unshed tears. "Thank you, Emma. That took a lot of courage." She paused, then continued. "I want both of your parents to hear this, and I want them to understand something. The law can mandate custody arrangements. The law can order child support and visitation schedules. But the law cannot force you to love your daughter less or more than you do right now. The law cannot make this better if you continue to fight. Only you can do that." She turned to address both parents directly, her voice carrying unmistakable authority. "You have heard your daughter articulate her needs with more clarity and emotional intelligence than either of you has demonstrated in 3 days of courtroom testimony. She has told you exactly what she needs: stability, access to both of you, freedom from conflict, and professional support to help your family heal." The judge looked directly at Emma one more time. "Emma, I want you to know that what you said today matters. It matters more than any testimony, any expert evaluation, any legal argument. Your voice, your needs, your perspective, these are what this court is going to prioritize moving forward." Emma nodded slowly, her hand still gripping Max's fur. The dog's steady presence seemed to communicate to everyone in the courtroom. This is what unconditional love looks like. This is what matters. The courtroom had changed. The adversarial atmosphere had been replaced by something different, a recognition of the human cost of legal warfare, an acknowledgement that somewhere in all the arguments and accusations, a child had been suffering in silence until finally, Through a service dog's unconditional presence and her own desperate courage, she had found her voice. 2 weeks had passed since that transformative day in the courtroom. The courthouse hallways were quiet and ordinary as Judge prepared to deliver her ruling. Her chambers were filled with legal documents, notes, psychological evaluations, and handwritten observations, the accumulated evidence of a case that had consumed weeks of court time and had fundamentally altered her understanding of what justice truly meant in custody matters. But the most important document on her desk wasn't a legal brief or a psychological report. It was a handwritten note from Emma, written in careful childish script that read, "Thank you for listening to me. I hope my mommy and daddy can be nice to each other now. Love, Emma." That note sat prominently on Judge's desk as she finalized her ruling. She had decided to make this hearing public, to allow the gallery to fill again, so that the community could witness something different. A custody case resolved not through winner-take-all litigation, but through prioritization of a child's actual needs and. Emma sat at the small table again, but this time her demeanor was noticeably different. She was calmer, more composed, with Max lying peacefully at her feet. Her anxiety levels had decreased dramatically over the past 2 weeks, a reduction that Dr. Sarah attributed to the profound relief of finally being heard and understood by an authority figure. Both parents sat at their respective tables, their attorneys beside them, but something had shifted between the parties as well. Emma's mother and father no longer refused to make eye contact. During the recess between rulings, Emma's mother had approached Emma's father in the hallway and had actually spoken to him, not with anger or accusation, but with something approaching civility. They had discussed, for the first time in months, not their grievances with each other, but their shared concern for Emma's. Judge entered the courtroom and took her seat. She looked out across the gallery at the assembled observers and began to speak. This case has consumed significant court resources and has caused immeasurable emotional damage to the parties involved. Over the course of 3 days of hearings, I listened to expert testimony, psychological evaluations, character assessments, and competing legal arguments. And then, in a moment of clarity, I decided to listen to the most important voice in this entire proceeding, the voice of the child at the center of this custody dispute. The judge adjusted her glasses and continued. What Emma revealed to me, through her direct testimony, was something that no expert witness could have articulated. She revealed a child suffering from acute anxiety and panic disorder directly attributable to parental conflict. She revealed a child who loves both parents unconditionally, but feels caught in an impossible situation. And most importantly, she revealed what would actually serve her best interests: shared custody with mandatory family counseling and professional support. Judge then read her ruling aloud, and it was unlike any custody order typically issued by her court. It is ordered that the minor, Emma, shall be placed in shared custody between both parents, with physical custody alternating on a weekly basis. Week 1, Monday through Thursday with mother, Thursday through Sunday with father. Week 2, reversed schedule. This arrangement shall be subject to modification based on the child's academic calendar and extracurricular activities, with both parents required to maintain open and respectful communication regarding scheduling. Emma's eyes widened with relief. She was going to see both her parents regularly. She wasn't going to have to choose. Furthermore, the judge continued, both parents are ordered to engage in individual psychological counseling with a therapist of their choosing, with the requirement that they each complete a minimum of 12 sessions addressing anger management, co-parenting strategies, and the resolution of conflict in healthy ways. Emma's mother nodded, accepting this requirement without objection. The parents are ordered to engage in joint family counseling sessions with Dr. Sarah, Emma's current therapist, for a minimum of 8 sessions per year. During these sessions, they will work collaboratively on developing communication strategies, co-parenting plans, and conflict resolution approaches that prioritize Emma's emotional, Judge paused and looked directly at Emma's parents. I want to be clear about something. This ruling is not a punishment. It is an opportunity. You have been given a gift, a daughter who loves you both and who has articulated clearly what she needs to thrive. Your responsibility now is to prove worthy of that love by putting her needs above your own anger and disappointment. The judge then addressed something unprecedented in a custody order. The court hereby formally recognizes Max, the minor's service dog, as a legitimate and necessary accommodation for the child's mental health needs. Both households are required to accommodate the service animal, and the dog shall travel with the minor between residences as needed. Any restriction or mistreatment of the service animal shall be considered a violation of this custody order. Emma squeezed Max's leash tightly, tears of happiness streaming down her face. The court is implementing a comprehensive monitoring and modification protocol, Judge continued. If either parent violates these orders, if either parent attempts to undermine the other parent's relationship with Emma, or if there is any evidence of increased conflict that negatively impacts the minor's mental health, the court will reconvene and will consider significant modifications to this arrangement. I reserve the right to modify custody based on subsequent evidence that one parent is not meeting the spirit and letter of this order. Judge looked directly at Emma one final time. Emma, I want you to know that this court heard you. Your voice mattered. Your needs are being prioritized. And if either of your parents fails to honor this order, if either of them returns to the conflict and warfare that brought you to the edge of a panic attack in this courtroom, you have the right to return to me and to have your voice heard again. The judge's gavel came down, not with the harsh finality it had struck throughout the previous hearings, but with a sound that felt like resolution and healing rather than judgment. This case is concluded. Court is adjourned. What happened next was extraordinary. As soon as the judge left the bench, Emma's mother stood up and walked toward Emma's father. For a moment, everyone in the courtroom held their breath, unsure what would happen. Then Emma's mother extended her hand toward Emma's father and said something that nobody could have predicted. Let's do this right. For Emma. Emma's father took her hand, and they stood together. Not as enemies, not even as ex-spouses, but as co-parents united by their love for their daughter. Emma ran to both of them, and for the first time in 2 years, all three of them stood together in a family embrace. Max stood beside them, his tail wagging, his presence a symbol of the unconditional love that had made this reconciliation possible. Over the following months, the transformation of Emma's family became visible to everyone who knew them. Emma's panic attacks diminished dramatically as the conflict subsided. Her parents began to communicate respectfully, initially with difficulty but with increasing ease as they progressed through their counseling sessions. They attended family sessions with Dr. Sarah and learned to manage their conflict in ways that protected Emma from being caught in the middle. Emma's father attended her school events regularly. Emma's mother welcomed him with civility and grace. The two adults never reconciled their romantic relationship. Their marriage was permanently over, but they transformed their relationship into a functional co-parenting partnership focused entirely on Emma's. Max remained Emma's constant companion, her anchor, her symbol of the moment when someone finally listened. The golden retriever would be there for the good days and the difficult days, providing the physical grounding and emotional support that helped Emma heal from the trauma of litigation. A little girl who had felt voiceless in a courtroom full of adults speaking about her, instead of to her had found her voice. And that voice had changed not just her own trajectory, but had fundamentally altered the way one judge approached custody cases thereafter. Judge would later tell her colleagues that watching Emma and Max that day in the courtroom was the most important professional lesson she had learned in her entire judicial career. That sometimes the law needed to step back and listen to the humanity it was meant to serve. That sometimes the most powerful verdict was simply the simple act of truly hearing a child and honoring what she had communicated about her own needs and dreams for her future. Emma's family had been broken by conflict and legal warfare, but they were being rebuilt on the foundation of listening, compassion, and a shared commitment to putting a child's above all else. And it had all begun with a little girl giving a secret signal to her dog, a signal that opened hearts, changed minds, and transformed a family forever.